Okay, hey, turkey, huh? Now I'm over here. I used to be over there. All right, let's talk about hiring. I broke a rule of ownership management and I hired three of my relatives Uncle Dennis Thornburg, Sherry Thornburg Dawson O'Neill's brother. Number two, my sister Steph. And number three, my brother-in-law, John Reinsch, Sister Diane's hubby. I fired them all for various reasons. The worst job of handling employee that I have ever done, I did to John Reinsch, and I won't get into details, they don't matter. But I'm talking, in hindsight, it was horrific. And not really in hindsight, I mean, I knew it almost as the words were coming out of my mouth. Sister Diane, his wife, my sister, didn't talk to me for 8 years. And I had apologized every way you can think of. Didn't matter. She was permanently pissed. That changed, as I think I talk about. Steph, firing my sister Steph was really a bonehead move because Steph is a perfectionist's perfectionist. She just didn't make a mistake, if you asked her. Well, my buddy Norm Lund was managing things at one point in time, and Steph made a comment about, well, that couldn't have happened. I never make a mistake. And Norm looked at her and went, what do you mean you never make a mistake? Are you nuts? Steph starts screaming at Norm about, don't tell me, and sobbing, and there was this huge nightmare. Steph ends up getting let go, and again, big mistake. I should have kept her. Uncle Denna was my driver all across the state of Nebraska and eventually Kansas and Oklahoma. My dad, Big Jack, made a table so I could work in the car and not just ride along with Denna. And the way this worked, we would remove the second seat of a minivan. So we had a front seat and the third seat and an opening. And in that opening, we would put this table that Dad had dreamed up and built, and it latched into the spots where the removed seats used to reside. So, I mean, it was rock solid. It wouldn't move. And so Denna would be driving to our next location or driving home, sometimes 400 miles. And I'd be sitting on the third seat, working on the table in the second seat. Just, I mean, it couldn't have been any more efficient. Then, oops. I hired, and I still see, a young gal named Sherry Abels, Judy Sand. Sherry was, come on, what are you doing here? I think that's better. Sherry was my office manager and paper processor on all this tax stuff. Judy Sands was an appointment setter. I hired and fired Judy 3 times. Judy was a management nightmare who was incredibly talented at setting these appointments. So I put up with the management messes because of the expertise. So I still see Sherry and Judy 15 years later. I hired somebody named Sherry Thornburg Dawson O'Neill. And weirdly, I see her more than everybody else combined. I hired a guy named Jay Dermaskin, and 15 years later, I still see him, and kind of goes on, not as frequent as those 4, but regularly. I hired Cindy Burdett, now Cindy Dean, her second hubby, and she was our next door neighbor, Sherry's buddy, and a shining example of had no idea what we were doing, but I hired her. She had many good attributes. I met her at a village inn, and I told her, we're going to go through a job interview. And she sits down. She was very bright-eyed, steel gray eyes. And I look her in the eye and I say, okay, Cindy, what's 6 times 3? And excitedly she goes, 18. And I about shit myself. And I said, okay, interview over. I love that. Am I an a-hole, you ask? Yes, on occasion. I had an appointment setter named Jeannie Waite. And when she would leave a message for people, and obviously she'd been doing this for years, she'd say, my name is Jeannie Waite, like pounds and ounces. Pretty good. She was an excellent employee. Another one who was a wizard at setting these appointments. Very professional, even though we never had a client come into the office. We always went there. She dressed to the nines every day. She believed in an Eastern religion, and by Easter I mean like country of India. And that religion believed in tithing, which isn't uncommon, giving 10% back. But this tithing was 10% of her time. So 24-hour day, 10% of it, 2.5 hours, she spent on her knees praying. I had never known anybody like her. I even let her work from Phoenix. She was so trustworthy, so productive. She told me one time, Phil, it is a life's goal to at some point go to India and spend 90 days learning from my teacher, like a guru. And I said, okay, go. Now, this was one of the critical people in the company, but I knew her. It's something she needed to do. You go, we'll backfill behind you. That's all good news. But it didn't end well. Jeff Lamb had been a salesman of ours, good salesman, classic look, Mr. Slick. Jeannie hated him, thought he was unethical, which is difficult given how simple our sale was. She would have nothing to do with the man. So Jeff goes away for a reason I don't even remember, and he's going to come back, and I let Jeannie in Phoenix know Jeff Lamb's coming back. She said, I won't work with Jeff Lamb. What do you mean you won't work with him? I'm not going to work with him. Pick him or me. Well, I hopped on a plane that night and met with this wonderful person, Jeannie Waite, and I said, now you got to understand, I'm the one who's going to make a decision as to who I keep, not you. If you want Jeff Lamb gone, if you have to have him gone, see ya. We packed up all her stuff and I flew home, and that was it for Jeannie Waite. We stayed in touch for several years, don't today, but goodbye, Jeannie. Oh, Judy Sands, who I hired and fired 3 times. I see Judy for lunch every 2 to 3 weeks, and she helped me over the course of 2022 with a failure, which I get into failures later, but she was the first person I went to when I thought about starting this new venture. I hired Chad Denton from Mid-City Bank, my bank, Jim Fiddle's bank. And we had a deal that he, if and when he ever left Mid-City Bank, I couldn't ask him to. I didn't want to mess with my relationship with Fiddle. But when he left, he was going to come to work with us. Chad now owns, to my knowledge, 75% of the company, and he is Nebraska's king of these economic development programs. He's always meeting with the governor and state senators and leading the drafting of legislation in this area. He is a big deal in this area. So we had that feature in our contract where we could work for you for 5 years after we were done with the inception work. Chad did those 5-year carryovers. Very stable, predictable work. And I mean, it basically guaranteed Chad a job forever. But I decided we were going to abandon LB 270, the program for the smaller companies, over time, and we were going to take on LB 775, which is for the big companies. Chad did not want to switch. He wanted that job security. Well, I told him, I hear you. You're going to 775. Turned out to be a good decision both for the company and for Chad. Years later, CFO Services now has 25 plus Fortune 500 companies and as clients, and hundreds across the state of Nebraska, pretty much a who's who of the state. And thank goodness he stayed, and thank goodness he chose us when he had other employment opportunities. I think he would now agree that worked out for the best for everybody. Chad is a very high-end salesman in addition to being a very good friend. Chad had the ability to stay in touch, stay in front of a prospect that he knew we could help for what seemed like forever. If it took, no exaggeration, 5 years of 2 or 3 times a year making a phone call and staying in touch with that decision maker, he would do it. Something I could not do. This is a little out of order, but so he was supposed to come to work for us when he left Mid-City Bank. Well, one Friday, Grandma Sherry is in the bank, and Chad is waiting on her. And he says, "Mrs. Dawson, it's been great working with you. I just wanted you to know this is my last day. I'm going to work for ConAgra on Monday in their mergers and acquisitions division." And Sherry said, "What? You're supposed to come to work with us." Oh, Phil's gonna be pissed when he hears this. So I wasn't happy. The next day, Saturday, I had a 3-hour lunch with Chad and his wife, Lori, 2 of the best people you could know. And I said at one point, "Chad, I can tell you for the next 3 to 5 years, pretty surely what you're going to be making at a ConAgra." And by the way, he had the same offer from FDR, First Data Resources, and chose ConAgra, but popular young man. So I said, "I can tell you roughly what you're going to be making 3 to 5 years." And some of those people at those massive Fortune 500 companies become the cream of the crop, top dog, and they make millions. But that's a very small number of people. No guarantees with us. We might even go bankrupt. But you know what we do, and you see the checks cross your desk every week, and you could own CFO services someday. So he said yes. And that Monday, he called up ConAgra and said, "I took a different position. Thank you for the offer," and came to work for us. Over time, I gave him 25% ownership in CFO services. We didn't have any contract that said I had an obligation to get him to 25% ownership, but he earned it. And where it made sense, I had an offer to sell the company for something over $1 million, and being my usual full disclosure self, they all knew we had an offer on the table. Chad got scared that I would sell and he would have nothing. And so he was the most valuable person in that company at that point, not moi. And so I had to get him comfortable. Then another key player, the other key player, is my good buddy John Blowbaum. And he came from another Fortune 500 thing, American Express. And they had a tax and business services arm. And he used to do our accounting work. He's that one only CPA that I hired. And he once told me that in all his years as a CPA, he had never seen a business as systematized and organized than us. And that was a nice compliment. It speaks a little bit, by the way, to my creative versus structured side. I enjoyed the creative more. I could certainly do the structured stuff. John became a very good friend. I know things about him and his kids and his relationships. Guarantee you, none of his wives knew or know. I just became a real good sounding board for him. When I sold the company after the 13 years, I, quote, he earned 10% of the company to John because Chad knew nothing about running a business. He just not had the experience. So I said, we're gonna give you a 2-year contract, and beyond that it's between you and Chad, but I need you to stay. And he was fine with that. He is now retired. His wife, Kathy, lived in Minneapolis, and they met on Match.com and had a 5-year, 400-mile-away relationship before she finally moved to Omaha, and they got married several years ago. So he's retired. They split their time between Omaha and Phoenix. Omaha, little bit of business he still does for Chad and kids here. Phoenix, because it's Phoenix. New houses in both places. Chad is jealous of John, but he's younger. His time will come. We had a year where we made $400,000 in the first 6 months of the year. Now, I had never made $1 million in a year or even thought about it. But I said, well, shit, if we would double the staff, we'd have a crack at making $1 million. So I hired 6 more employees to do that new line of work in Kansas. And I told them at the start, I have no idea whether this will work. If it does, you'll likely be here forever if you so choose. If it doesn't, you'll be out the door. Anybody not understand this? They understood it. A year later, it had failed. They were let go. Crap. 2 of those 6 people I still see all the time, but that was not easy on Phil. I really don't recall anybody being really pissed when I let him go. Now, we didn't let go very many, but I had lots of upfront communication with employees about what their goals are and meeting those goals. And I mean, I would sit with people for as long as it took for them to understand their role, what they had to do. So if I let them go, I could say, well, here's what we agreed. You aren't doing it. I'm sorry, but we're gone. So the Kansas thing, not good, but again, I had real good communication. To more employment screw-ups. I didn't hire a young guy named Greg Weideman, who I see 4 or 5 times a year, or Bob Johnson, one of my best friends. I see him every 2 weeks without fail. I didn't hire Greg Weideman because he was a gunner, just like Chad Denton. And so I honestly thought, well, if I hire Greg Weideman, he and Chad are going to ruin their marriages. They will be so competitive that it will consume them. And so I didn't hire him, Greg. So as it turns out, as predicted, Greg went on to do entirely different things, of course, and did very well with them. He would have been a great hire, and I do wonder, should I have, but even today, I think I would say, nah, for the same reasons. Then we ran an ad in the newspaper, and we didn't say who the company was, and the resume was directed to a P.O. box, but apparently we had said just enough that Bob Johnson knew who it was. And so he just called me direct. Now, how did I know Bob? He was the local manager for a Fortune 500 company, and we called on him. And that's back in the days when I was still making sales calls on these big prospects before Chad came along. And Bob said, Phil, you know, I thought about this. I can see where you'd provide some benefit, but, you know, crap. I can hire another accountant to do nothing but this and be money ahead. Now, he was wrong, but okay. Bob went on to do yet another completely weird tax thing and is a multi-millionaire today. And when I met Bob, he was literally paycheck to paycheck. And it's so wonderful to see your buds do well like that. Just wonderful. Okay, that big program, LB 775. I think earlier I said first big fee was $109,000. Precision Industries paid us that. Interestingly, that number is more than what I made my first 4 years out of UNL, Husker U, in a couple weeks worth of work. First $200,000 bill was sent and paid, and I'm rounding up. It was really only $195,000. The company was Zurich Insurance, and there's a long story about how I had to chase, and literally on the last day they could apply for this thing, bring the paperwork and a pen and insist that I see the guy who could make the decision. And he signed up, and if we made 195, he made in the millions on that deal. Now just some random CFO services stuff. Whenever Sherry and I and you guys would go on a driving trip, which was fairly frequently, within the first hour, maybe 2, my mind would download all kinds of thoughts on all kinds of issues. And I would call Sherry Abels, our office manager person, and tell her, all right, take this down. And she had the perspective that Sherry wouldn't have had to, do with them as we see. So every trip for like an hour, maybe two. Oh, also, every person working at CFO who was there when I left, with the exception of Sherry, who's probably making only $75,000 a year, every one of those other people was and is making over $100,000 salary a year. Not bad. I mentioned variable compensation earlier, and the way that worked, we'd sit down as a group in December of a year, and the theory was I would say, okay, I need to make $250,000. And then anything over that we net, you guys get a percentage of. Well, they used to get 40% of the profits over that 250, the way the math worked, which was a boatload of money for those people. Cindy Burdett, previously mentioned, drove that and did it well. Give me another minute. Yeah, I'm gonna have to stop here, and the next section will take care of this. A famous line, a famous philism. I have to make lots of money, but I don't have to make it all. See you in a little bit.